My daughter-in-law set a suitcase down in the middle of the living room and said, her voice as light as if she were talking about the weather, "Dad, don't worry. You just need to move into the small room in the back. My parents will be moving in next week." I stood there, frozen, still holding the house keys in my hand. Not because of what she said, but because I realized a decision had just been made for me inside the very house I had paid off more than 30 years ago. My son stood behind his wife, silent, head lowered. I looked at them for a few seconds. Then I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that arguing right then would only make me lose my house faster. That night, while their entire family slept soundly in my living room, I opened the drawer my wife had once held my hand and warned me about. Only open it when you're truly backed into a corner with no way out. If my daughter-in-law thought setting that suitcase down on my floor was a victory, then she had made her first mistake, and it would also be her most expensive one. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts, and if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Raymond Cole, 69 years old, widowed for nearly a year. I bought this house when I was just over 30, during a windy fall in Ohio, when Daniel was still in elementary school and Evelyn, my wife, was still laughing a lot. I paid off the bank loan more than 30 years ago. Every brick, every wooden board in this place is tied to sweat, overtime shifts, and evenings when I came home late, my shirt still smelling of machine oil, just to make it in time for a family dinner. After Evelyn passed away, I lived alone. Not noisy, not dramatic. I learned how to make coffee for one instead of two, learned how to do laundry without asking, "Where did you put this shirt?" and learned how to walk past the bedroom each night without turning on the light on the other side of the bed. I thought I had gotten used to the silence, but it turned out I had only gotten used to grief, not to the feeling of being pushed aside. Daniel and Melissa came to visit on a Friday afternoon. I had prepared the living room, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, exactly the dishes Daniel had loved since he was little. I thought it was just a normal weekend, visiting an old dad, having dinner, then heading home. I was wrong. Melissa walked in first. Her high heels tapped against my familiar wooden floor like a steady rhythm, neither fast nor slow. She looked around the house, her eyes sweeping over every corner, every framed photo on the walls. Me and Evelyn at Yellowstone, Daniel's college graduation, a Christmas photo from nearly 10 years ago. Those eyes carried no memories. They carried evaluation. Daniel followed behind, carrying bags, his gaze avoiding mine as if even he wasn't sure whose house he was walking into. Then the suitcase appeared. Large, new, placed squarely in the middle of the living room. No asking, no permission, no hesitation. And that sentence was released, light as a breeze, heavy as a verdict. I remember that moment clearly. Every sound in the house seemed to fade into the background. I heard the wall clock, the one Evelyn loved, ticking steadily. I heard the refrigerator humming softly. I even heard my own heartbeat, slow but clear. Melissa didn't ask whether I agreed. She spoke as if everything had already been settled, as if I were merely someone who needed to be informed. I turned to Daniel. I waited for him to say something, anything. But he just stood there, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes fixed on the wooden floor. In that moment, I no longer saw the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who used to follow me around the garage asking why cars needed oil changes. I saw a man who had grown used to staying silent to avoid trouble, even when that silence hurt his own father. I didn't lose my temper, not because I wasn't angry, but because I understood very clearly. If I reacted then, I would become the difficult old man, uncooperative, out of touch. I had lived long enough to know how quickly society labels the elderly. I nodded, just a very small nod. And in that moment, I saw something flash in Melissa's eyes. Very quickly. Not gratitude, but confirmation. As if she had just scored a point in a game I hadn't even been invited to sit down and play. The evening passed in a strange atmosphere. Melissa talked a lot about plans, about family, about how living together makes caregiving easier. She used words that sounded very considerate, but between those words was something never said out loud. This house was no longer mine. Daniel ate very little. He nodded along with everything his wife said. Occasionally he looked at me, but his gaze never stayed long enough to become an apology. Night fell. They laid out mattresses and slept right in the living room. I went up to my bedroom and closed the door. For the first time since Evelyn died, I locked my bedroom door. I sat on the bed for a long time in the dark. I didn't turn on the light. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry in a loud way. What I felt then was a cold clarity, a familiar feeling, exactly like the one I used to have when I discovered a serious flaw in an engineering blueprint, knowing that if it wasn't handled correctly, the entire bridge could collapse. But if I rushed, I would be the first one held responsible. I stood up and opened the nightstand drawer, the drawer I hadn't touched since after the funeral. My hand brushed against the familiar wood. I remembered the day Evelyn placed her hand over mine, her voice weak, but her eyes firm. "Ray, promise me one thing." "What is it?" "Don't open it unless you're truly pushed to the point where there's no way back." Back then, I nodded to reassure her. I thought it was just the worry of a woman who knew her time was coming. I didn't ask more. I didn't want her to think I was preparing for the worst. Now, in the dark room, with the steady breathing of people sleeping in my house, I knew. This was the dead end Evelyn had seen long before I did. I pulled the drawer open. The envelope lay there, light brown, the edges slightly worn. No writing on the outside, no decoration. Very much like Evelyn, always preparing everything quietly, carefully, without showing off. I didn't open it right away. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the weight of the papers inside, and wondered what my wife had gone through, and for how long, to prepare this. Outside, I heard Melissa shift in her sleep, fabric rustling. I heard Daniel cough softly. They slept very peacefully, as if this house had been theirs for a long time. I set the envelope down on the table and sat up straight. I understood one thing very clearly. From the moment that suitcase was placed in the living room, everything had changed. This was no longer a family visit. This was a calculated move. And my silence earlier wasn't surrender. It was the only choice that allowed me to stay on the board. I didn't know exactly what Evelyn had left behind, but I knew one thing. She never did anything without a reason. If she told me to open it only when I was backed into a corner, then she had seen something that I, out of love, trust, and the busyness of life, had overlooked. I took a deep breath. That night, for the first time in many months, I didn't feel like just a widowed old man trying to get through another day. I felt like I was standing in front of a test. And strangely enough, I felt I was still clear-headed enough, patient enough, and knowledgeable enough about people not to lose in a foolish way. If Melissa thought I nodded out of fear, if Daniel thought I stayed silent out of weakness, then neither of them truly understood me. And they also didn't understand the woman who had lived beside me for more than 35 years. The woman who had prepared for this day long ago, while all of us still believed that family was the safest place of all. That was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because of an old habit from living nearly 40 years in the same house. 6 a.m., soft sunlight filtered through the kitchen window curtains, falling onto the wooden table Evelyn used to wipe down every night. I made coffee for one, as I had been doing for nearly a year, and sat down, listening to the house wake up in its familiar way. But that morning, the house no longer woke up with me. Around 8 a.m., the doorbell rang. Then came a knock, firm, without hesitation. I hadn't even stood up yet when Melissa appeared from the living room, her hair neatly done, her face unusually alert, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Dad, let me get it," she said, her voice friendly but unnecessary. The door opened. Standing in front of me was a middle-aged man with a slight belly, wearing a light windbreaker, strong cologne on him. Beside him was a woman with dyed blonde hair, her eyes darting quickly across the porch like she was stepping into a model home. Behind them, a younger girl dragged 2 small suitcases, earbuds in, eyes glued to her phone. "Dad, these are my parents. And my sister, Rachel," Melissa said, turning back toward me as if I were the guest being introduced. I nodded. Once again. They walked into the house without waiting to be invited. The man, Melissa's father, took off his shoes, set them neatly aside, and walked straight into the living room. The woman followed, her hand brushing the back of the sofa, her eyes pausing on the wedding photo on the wall for a beat longer, then turning away as if uninterested. The young girl passed right by me, her shoulder nearly brushing my hand holding the coffee cup without apologizing. I stood there in the hallway, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know where I was supposed to stand in my own house. "Oh, the living room is really spacious," the man said, sounding slightly surprised. "But it probably gets cold at night. Old houses usually aren't well insulated." "We're planning to replace the windows later," Melissa replied quickly, as if that decision had already been made. "Replace the windows." I repeated it silently. Those windows, Evelyn and I had chosen each one ourselves, back when Daniel was in high school. I clearly remembered the day we argued for hours just over the color of the frames. But now they were just windows that need replacing. They walked through the entire house. No asking, no hesitation, no trace of restraint. The woman, Melissa's mother, opened every door, looked inside, nodded, then leaned toward her daughter to whisper. I didn't catch every word, just fragments. "This room works, that one's small, maybe storage." My study, the room where I kept old blueprints, documents, and the chair where Evelyn used to sit reading, was opened without anyone asking. The man stepped in first, looked around and frowned. "This could be a secondary living room," he said. "Just move the desk out and it's done." I stood in the doorway. I could have said it was my room. I could have said I still used it every day. I could have said many things, but I didn't, because I was looking at Daniel. My son stood at the end of the hallway, hands in his pockets, his eyes flicking toward me and then quickly away when they met mine. I clearly saw him open his mouth as if to say something, then stop. Melissa shot him a quick glance, very fast, very subtle, but enough. At noon they assigned rooms, not by asking, but by stating it like a shopping list. "My parents will take the master bedroom upstairs," Melissa said. "It has a private bathroom, more convenient for older people." Older people. For the first time, that word didn't apply to me. "Rachel will use the guest room. And Dad," Melissa turned to me and smiled. "Dad can take the small room in the back. It's closer to the kitchen, easier to get around." The small room in the back. The room we used to store things, where Evelyn once said, "When we're older, if we need to, we can remodel it to make things easier." I don't remember how many times I nodded over those 2 days. I only remember that with each nod, one thing became clearer. Everything was moving far too smoothly for them. In the afternoon, the woman began cleaning. That's what she called it. She opened kitchen cabinets, took out stacks of dishes, and rearranged them her way. The ceramic bowl with a small crack on the rim, a wedding gift from Evelyn's mother, was set aside. "This is too old," she said calmly. "Why keep it? It just takes up space." I looked at that bowl sitting alone on the table. I remembered the dinners Evelyn served soup in it, her hand trembling slightly when her illness worsened. I remembered how carefully I washed it afterward, but to them it was just an old item. Rachel claimed the sofa. She stretched out, feet on the cushions, turned on the TV, flipping channels non-stop. When I stepped into the living room to grab my jacket, she didn't move. "You should be careful walking around," she said without looking away from the screen. "Crowded houses are dangerous. Old people fall easily. One fall can be serious." The sentence wasn't openly malicious, but it carried an assumption that I was fragile, breakable, a burden waiting to happen. I smiled lightly, not to respond, but to stop myself from saying something that would push things out of control. Daniel spoke less and less. Every time I asked him something, he looked at Melissa before answering. Sometimes he answered for her. Sometimes he didn't answer at all. That night, I moved into the small room in the back. The room was colder than I expected. I brought a few sets of clothes, placed them on the bed, and closed the door. Not to avoid them, but to preserve the last bit of space that was still mine. Lying on the bed, I listened to their voices in the living room. Small conversations, fragmented but constant. Plans, half-joking remarks, repeated mentions of safety, age, how living alone isn't good. I didn't hear concern, I heard preparation. And for the first time, I clearly felt something I had only vaguely sensed before. They hadn't come just to stay temporarily. They had come to stay, and not as guests. I turned over, staring at the ceiling. In the darkness, the image of that suitcase in the middle of the living room became clearer than ever. It wasn't just a suitcase, it was a marker. And from that marker on, I knew I was stepping into a phase where every word, every silence, every nod had a price. I didn't know how long they had been planning this, but I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't fully understand this game, I would be the one eliminated from it first. I closed my eyes, letting the house that had once been a home, sink into a restless sleep filled with unfamiliar sounds. And in my mind, for the first time since Evelyn passed away, a thought surfaced with chilling clarity. Some battles don't begin with shouting. They begin when people walk into your home and act as if you never belonged there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of footsteps in the hallway, and not because of the hushed voices drifting in from the living room. I had already grown used to those unfamiliar sounds in just 2 short days, as if the house had learned to change owners faster than I ever imagined. I couldn't sleep because of the envelope sitting on my nightstand. It lay there, silent. No decoration, no label, nothing distinctive. But I knew exactly what I was looking at. I had lived with Evelyn for more than 35 years. I knew how she hid important things. Never showy. Never left in obvious places. Always discreet enough to avoid attention, yet close enough for the right person to find. I clearly remembered the afternoon she mentioned that envelope. It was a rainy day, a light, persistent rain, the kind that made the house so quiet you could hear the second hand of the clock ticking. Evelyn was already very weak then. She sat in the armchair by the window, a thin blanket across her knees. I was busy in the kitchen when I heard her call my name, not loudly but firmly. "Ray, come here." I walked over and sat beside her. Her hand was colder than usual. She held mine tightly, tight enough to make me look straight into her eyes. "Promise me one thing." "What is it?" I asked, forcing a smile to reassure her. She didn't smile back. Her expression was so serious that I felt a chill run down my spine. "There's something you'll find in the drawer. Don't open it. Don't read it. Don't do anything." "Then what's it for?" I asked, half joking. "Only open it when you're truly pushed to the point where there's no way back." I was about to ask more. So many questions. But then I saw how tired she was. I saw her hand tremble slightly, and like so many times in our marriage, I chose to trust her without pressing further. I nodded, and a few months later, she was gone. For nearly a year, I didn't open that drawer, not because I forgot about it, but because I didn't believe I would ever need what was inside. I thought Evelyn's worries came from illness, from exhaustion, from fear of leaving me alone in this world. I was wrong. I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. The soft yellow light filled the small room in the back, the room that had now become my living space inside the very house I once owned outright. I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Not much, but enough to know there was more than a single sheet of paper inside. I opened the envelope slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. There was no smell of old paper, no photographs, no emotional handwritten letter like I had imagined during long nights missing my wife. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, carefully organized. The first page was a letter, not long, not flowery, exactly like Evelyn. Ray, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has happened. I hope I was wrong, but if not, please read everything before you do anything else. I paused, took a deep breath, then continued. She wrote that she had never trusted Melissa, even in the early years, not out of hatred, not out of jealousy toward her daughter-in-law, but because she noticed the way Melissa looked at the house. Not with the eyes of a visitor, but with the eyes of someone calculating. She described very small details. The times Melissa asked about the house paperwork. The joking comments about needing someone to manage things when you're old. The looks she gave when Evelyn said everything was already taken care of. Everything was very polite, Evelyn wrote, but politeness doesn't mean innocence. My throat went dry. She wrote that she had wondered if she was being overly sensitive, that maybe it was just the worry of an aging mother. But the signs kept repeating, and her intuition, the thing I had always seen her trust more than logic, wouldn't let her go. The following pages were no longer letters. They were copies of legal documents, an updated will, a revised family trust agreement, asset protection clauses triggered by signs of coercion, manipulation, or exploitation of an elderly person. I read slowly, very slowly. There was the name of a lawyer, an office address, a phone number, marginal notes in Evelyn's familiar handwriting, guiding me on who to contact and under what circumstances. There was also a list of accounts, not to move money, but to prove that control still belonged to me if I knew how to use it at the right time. I sat completely still for a long time, not because I didn't understand what I was reading. I had worked with contracts and documents my entire life. I understood every line clearly. I understood that Evelyn had built a solid legal barrier around this house, around this life. What took my breath away was something else. She had done all of this alone. While I still believed family was a safe place, while I trusted my son would never let this happen, while I assumed that if something were wrong, I would be the first to notice. Evelyn had seen it before I did. She had spent the final months of her life not only battling illness, but worrying that after she was gone, I would become a target. And she chose to prepare quietly instead of creating a confrontation that might shatter the family. I folded the letter. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of grief. I grieved for her, for carrying this burden alone. I grieved for myself, for not realizing sooner. And I even grieved for Daniel, the son we both tried so hard to protect, perhaps so much that he never had the chance to grow up in time. I looked at the other side of the bed, where Evelyn used to lie. For a moment, I almost heard her voice. No blame, no bitterness, just calm, as always. You have to stay clear-headed, Ray. I understood. I wasn't an old man pushed into a corner with no options. I was someone who had been prepared, not for revenge, not for punishment, but so that no one could take what no one had the right to take. I placed the documents back into the envelope. I didn't hide it again. I put it into a new drawer, one I could reach at any time. Not because I was afraid I'd need it immediately, but because I knew that from now on I had to be proactive. I didn't plan to talk to Melissa yet. I didn't plan to confront Daniel yet. And I certainly didn't plan to show any sign that I understood what was happening. Because one thing Evelyn wrote very clearly in the last line of her letter was this: "Don't stop them too soon. Let them go too far on their own." I turned off the light. In the darkness, I felt a very small but very real shift inside myself. Not anger, not fear, clarity. From that moment on, I knew every move I made had to be slow, precise, and quiet, just like Evelyn had done, just like those who truly understand the game always do. Outside, the house was still filled with unfamiliar sounds, footsteps that didn't belong to me, voices that asked no permission. I closed my eyes. They thought I didn't know anything, and I was going to let them keep thinking that. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. Not exactly anxiety and no longer shock. It felt like realizing you're standing in the middle of a busy intersection, and if you don't slow down, you'll be swept away. I made coffee, the same old kettle, the same familiar smell filling the kitchen, but the kitchen no longer felt like mine the way it used to. The cups had been rearranged, the sugar jar moved to a higher shelf. A new towel, one that didn't belong to Evelyn, hung from the cabinet handle. I stood there for a few seconds and told myself not to focus on small details. But the more I tried not to look, the clearer it became. Someone was reorganizing my life their way. Melissa walked into the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't see me, or she did and didn't care. Her voice was lowered, but not enough for someone standing at the counter not to hear. "Yes, I understand, but this case has to be handled carefully," she said, her tone no longer gentle. "He's still lucid, at least on paper." I turned my back, pretending to open the refrigerator. "No, not yet. There has to be an evaluation first, a capacity evaluation. Yes, just like last time." I froze, my hand resting on the cold refrigerator door. A capacity evaluation. I didn't need to hear more to understand what that meant. I had spent my entire career in environments where legal language was used like a scalpel, precise, cold, and never accidental. That phrase didn't belong in family conversations. It belonged in files, in courtrooms, in decisions that couldn't be undone. Melissa moved closer to the back door, probably to talk privately, but this house wasn't that soundproof. "It has to be done while it's still legal," she continued. "As long as everything is still in his name, the transfer will be clean. If we wait too long, he might change his mind." She paused, then laughed softly. "It's fine. Our family has done this before. I know the process." Our family has done this before. I closed the refrigerator door. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet kitchen. I didn't breathe heavily. I didn't step out. I just stood there, motionless, as if one wrong move would make everything shatter. In my mind, scattered pieces began to fit together in a frightening way. The casual comments about safety, the repeated reminders about age, them taking over the larger rooms and living spaces, Daniel being pushed out of every decision, reduced to nodding along. This wasn't chaos. This was a pattern, and that pattern had been used before, just not on me. Melissa came back into the kitchen and slipped her phone into her pocket. She looked at me and smiled, that familiar smile. "You're up early, Dad," she said. "Older people tend to have trouble sleeping." I nodded, lifted my coffee cup, and took a small sip. The bitterness spread across my tongue, sharper than usual. "Just an old habit," I replied. "Hard to break." She didn't say anything else, but her eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as if reassessing an item before adding it to a list. All day long, I began noticing details I might have overlooked before. Quiet conversations when I wasn't in the room, or when they thought I wasn't. Quick glances exchanged between Melissa's parents. Seemingly harmless questions about house documents, insurance, and what paperwork I still kept. "Where do you keep your important papers?" Melissa's mother asked at lunch, her tone friendly. "In case something happens, we'd know how to handle it." In another context, that might have sounded caring, but after everything I had heard, it meant something very different. "In the drawer," I replied calmly. "Just the essentials." She nodded and smiled. But I clearly saw her glance at Melissa, as if confirming an important detail. That afternoon, I saw Melissa's father rummaging through my old study. He said he was just looking around. I didn't ask what he was searching for. I simply remembered. That evening, after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat in the small back room, turned on the desk lamp, and pulled out an old notebook, the one I used to jot down work notes. Now it had a different purpose. I began to write: date, time, who said what, where, in what tone, no assumptions, no motives assigned, just facts. Melissa talked about a capacity evaluation at 7:15 a.m. in the kitchen, mentioned transferring while still legal, said, "Our family has done this before." Her parents asked about documents, entered my study without permission, discussed dividing living space as if it had already been decided. Daniel remained silent, always looked to his wife before answering, neither objected nor confirmed. I wrote very slowly, very steadily, as if drafting an engineering plan where one wrong line could lead to serious consequences. When I finished, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The danger of this situation was greater than I had first imagined. Not because they spoke openly, but because they knew how to speak indirectly, how to turn taking something into care, how to turn stripping rights into protection. And what sent the deepest chill down my spine was realizing this: if I reacted at the wrong moment, I would become proof of the very story they were building. A difficult old man. Someone uncooperative. Someone with signs. Evelyn was right. Completely right. I opened the envelope one more time, not to reread it, but to find a name. A person Evelyn had circled very lightly in pencil with a short note beside it. Contact for initial consultation. Do not reveal. I didn't call right away. Not yet. But I wrote that phone number on a separate piece of paper, folded it, and placed it in my wallet. I looked around the small room, listening to the house breathe. That sound only people who have lived long enough in one place can recognize. This house was holding far too many footsteps that didn't belong to it. And I understood one thing very clearly. This was no longer about an inconvenient family living arrangement. This was a plan being carried out step by step, day by day, with frightening patience. I didn't know who they thought I was. Maybe they thought I was just a widowed old man, used to giving in, used to staying quiet, used to trusting people. I closed the notebook. If that's what they believed, then I would let them keep believing it, at least until they crossed the very line they had drawn themselves. Because from the moment I heard the phrase capacity evaluation, I knew this house was no longer playing an innocent game, and I would not be the first to show my cards. That afternoon, gray clouds rolled in quickly, the kind of weather common to this area. Not raining yet, but heavy enough to make the air feel dense, as if everything were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was sitting in the small back room, the door slightly ajar, the notebook resting on the table unopened. I didn't write anything else, not because there was nothing left to record, but because I needed silence to organize everything I had seen, heard, and understood over the past few short days. The doorbell rang. Not insistently, not hurriedly. A familiar ring, the kind used by someone who had lived in this neighborhood for many years. I knew that sound. Before Melissa could step out of the kitchen, I stood up. I didn't want her to be the one to open the door. Margaret Hale stood on the porch, carrying a light blue fabric bag, her silver hair neatly combed, a thin coat draped over her shoulders. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than normal politeness, before smiling. A gentle smile, but not a careless one. "Ray," she said, her voice low and slow. "I'm sorry for coming without calling first." "It's all right," I replied, opening the door wider. "Come in." Margaret had lived in the house across the street for more than 20 years. She and Evelyn had known each other since the day we moved here. Those two women, one quiet, one cautious, became friends in an unassuming way. They didn't shop together. They didn't gossip. They simply sat on the porch from time to time, drank tea, and talked just enough to understand each other. Margaret stepped inside, her eyes scanning the living room, pausing on the suitcases neatly stacked in the corner, on the sofa that had been claimed, then returning to me. She didn't ask, she didn't comment, but I could see the change in her expression. "Evelyn once told me there would be a day when this house wouldn't be quiet anymore," she said as we sat at the dining table. I thought she was just speaking loosely. I stayed silent. I didn't know where to begin. Or maybe I didn't need to begin at all. Margaret set the fabric bag on the table and opened it very slowly. Inside were not pastries or small gifts like before. Inside was a stack of papers, neatly tied with thin string, and an old phone, one of those models no one had used in years. "Evelyn asked me to keep these," she said softly. "She told me to give them to you only when I felt it couldn't wait any longer." A cold wave ran down my spine, not from surprise but from confirmation. What I had been experiencing was no longer a personal intuition. It had been within Evelyn's foresight for a long time. Margaret explained that Evelyn had asked her to observe things starting about 3 years earlier, when Melissa and Daniel moved closer. Not to spy, just to note anything unusual. Repeated questions, evaluating looks, statements that sounded harmless at first, but lost their innocence through repetition. "She didn't want you to worry," Margaret said, "and she didn't want to create conflict too early. Evelyn always believed that if she prepared thoroughly enough, you would never have to use any of it." She untied the bundle of papers. Each page was clearly dated. No rambling, no judgment, just records. June 12th. Melissa asked about the house documents, said, "It'll be useful to know later." September 3rd. Melissa told Evelyn that older people usually don't pay much attention to legal matters. November 18th, Melissa's parents visited, discussed living together for easier care. Margaret didn't look at me as she read. She read as if confirming to herself that she had done what needed to be done. Then she took out the old phone and turned it on. The screen lit up slowly, as if it too had been waiting for a long time. "There are a few photos," she said, "and a few short recordings. Not much, but enough to show this wasn't random." I didn't take the phone right away. I looked at Margaret. For the first time since Evelyn passed, I looked at another person and realized they knew my wife better than I did in some way. "What was she afraid of?" I asked quietly. Margaret paused and took a deep breath. "She was afraid you'd trust too much," she said, "and give in too soon." I let out a soft laugh. Not happy, not sad, just reflex. The photos weren't dramatic. Just Melissa standing on the porch talking to her parents, her expression far more serious than her usual friendly look. Another showed Melissa pointing toward my house while the man beside her nodded. One short audio clip, voices low but clear enough to hear the phrase, "The paperwork is still in his name." Nothing that could convict, but far too much to deny. I sat there, feeling as if thin layers of curtain were being pulled away. Evelyn hadn't just left me an envelope. She had left me a network, not to attack anyone, but so I wouldn't stand alone if that day came. She was very careful, Margaret continued. She said if things unfolded the way she feared, the only thing you should trust was the truth, not words. I nodded. This nod was different from the others. It wasn't surrender. It was agreement with a plan that had already been set in motion. We sat in silence for a long while. Outside, cars passed along the familiar road. The house was still noisy in the living room, where others were laughing and talking as if nothing were wrong. What should I do? I asked. Not because I didn't know, but because I needed to hear it from someone else. Margaret looked straight at me. You shouldn't do anything hastily, she said. Evelyn was very clear. Observe, record, and only step into the light when they place themselves in the dark. I understood. I understood that this wasn't the time for emotional reactions, not the time to reclaim authority through raised voices. This was the time to let things continue, just a little longer, until no one could say I misunderstood, that I was paranoid, that I imagined things. Margaret stood up and picked up her bag. Before leaving, she placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. Evelyn trusted you, she said. She knew you were patient enough. The door closed. The lock clicked softly. I stood alone in the kitchen, my hand resting on the familiar wooden table. I opened my notebook. This time, I added a new section. Not Melissa's actions, not her parents' words, but what Evelyn had prepared, layer by layer. I no longer doubted my instincts. I no longer wondered if I was being too sensitive. Everything was clear. I looked toward the living room where laughter echoed. I knew they thought I didn't know anything. I knew they believed I was being pushed aside without resistance. And in that moment, I made my first fully clear-headed decision. I would not stop them. I would not warn them. I would not retreat. I would let them continue, exactly the way they always had. Because now, I didn't just have memories. I had preparation, I had witnesses, and I had time. My counterattack would not begin with noise. It would begin with patience. I went to Thomas Reed's office on a quiet Monday morning when the city hadn't fully awakened yet. The building sat on a tree-lined street, unremarkable, no flashy signage. If you didn't know better, you might think it was just a small advisory office where time moved more slowly than the rest of the city. Evelyn once told me that if I ever had to seek out Thomas, it would mean things had gone too far. I laughed then, thinking she worried too much. I never imagined I'd be sitting here, my hand resting on an old leather briefcase, my heart heavy, but my mind strangely clear. Thomas Reed stood when I entered. He was in his early 60s, thin, with more gray than black hair, wire-rimmed glasses resting low on his nose. His eyes held no scrutiny, no pity, just a familiar calm, as if he had been expecting this meeting for a long time. "Raymond," he said slowly, "I'm very sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." I nodded. Evelyn said if I came here, you'd understand. Thomas smiled faintly and gestured for me to sit. She prepared very carefully. We didn't waste time. I placed the documents from the green envelope on the table, along with my notebook and the old phone Margaret had given me. Thomas looked at each item without touching them immediately, like someone accustomed to dealing with things that couldn't be undone. "The asset protection clause Evelyn set up," he began, "isn't common. It's designed for very specific situations." He opened a file and flipped to a marked page. Dense, dry text, but every word carried weight. "It's triggered by signs of coercion, psychological abuse, or threats meant to strip the owner of decision-making authority," Thomas said. "There doesn't need to be violence, just enough to show that you're no longer free to choose." I leaned back. "So where do I stand right now?" Thomas looked directly at me. About 60 to 70%. He wasn't reassuring me. He was speaking like an engineer evaluating the load-bearing strength of a bridge. We have a pattern, he continued. We have repeated behavior. We have implied language. We have indirect witnesses. But we're missing one thing. I already knew what he was going to say. A direct threat, Thomas said, or a clear action showing they're trying to force you to sign, transfer assets, or give up your right to decide. I stayed quiet, not from fear, but because I understood what that meant. Evelyn left you a very solid defensive structure, Thomas added, but that structure only activates when the other side crosses the line themselves. I looked down at my hands. They weren't as steady as they used to be, but they were still steady enough to hold a pen, to sign my name, to refuse. You're saying, I said slowly, that I need Melissa to cross that line. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He removed his glasses and set them on the table. I'm saying, he replied carefully, you don't need to create anything. You just need to let things unfold according to their nature. I understood. People like Melissa weren't used to being delayed, weren't used to losing control, and they especially weren't used to prolonged silence from someone they considered weak. If you openly resist, Thomas said, they'll become more cautious, but if you appear tired, compliant, even confused, they'll rush. I gave a faint smile. Not a happy one. Pretend to be weak, I said. Pretend to give in. Thomas nodded. A difficult role, but I believe you can do it. We discussed details, not too deeply, not too quickly. Thomas emphasized one rule above all. Don't let emotions disrupt the rhythm. Don't react when provoked. Don't appear smarter than necessary. They need to believe they're winning, he said, and you need the patience to let them say what they shouldn't. When I left the office, the sun was higher. I stood on the steps for a moment and took a deep breath. I didn't feel relieved, but I felt steadier. On the way home, I thought of Evelyn. Not with the raw pain of the first months after she died, but with a new kind of respect. She hadn't just been the gentle wife I knew. She was someone who saw the storm while the sky was still clear. When I opened the door and stepped inside, familiar noise rushed toward me. Voices, television, footsteps. My house now felt like a station. People coming and going without asking. Melissa looked up when she saw me. Her eyes swept over me quickly, like checking whether an item was still intact. "Where did you go this morning?" she asked lightly, though the scrutiny was there. "I went out for a bit," I replied, setting my keys on the table. "I'm a little tired." Daniel stood nearby, holding his phone, not looking at me. I saw his shoulders tense for a second, then relax. He was learning to stay silent, just as I once had. I pulled out a chair and sat down, more slowly than usual. I let my hand tremble slightly as I held the glass of water. Not too obvious, just enough for someone observant to notice. Melissa was watching. I knew it. "You should rest more, Dad," she said. "Living alone at this age, it's not always safe." I didn't argue. I nodded, as if her words had touched a quiet, hidden worry. "Maybe," I said softly. "Maybe you're right." I saw Melissa's eyes light up for a split second. Very fast, but I saw it. That night I went to my room earlier than usual. I left the door slightly open. I kept the desk lamp on all night. I left my notebook lying openly on the desk, not hidden. I began my role, not to deceive them, but to make them believe I had started to doubt myself. And when someone begins to doubt themselves, those who want to control them never wait long. I lay on the bed, eyes open in the dark. My heartbeat was steady. My mind was clear. The game had entered a new phase, and this time I knew my role. The change in Daniel didn't come suddenly. It wasn't like a collapse or a dramatic awakening the way people imagine. It came slowly, very slowly, like a small crack in glass. At first, it was just a faint line, but when the light hit it at the right angle, you could no longer pretend it wasn't there. I planted the first seed on a very ordinary evening. We were sitting at the dinner table. Melissa was talking to her mother on the phone, laughing as she spoke, her voice loud enough for the whole house to hear. Daniel sat across from me, silent, turning his fork in his hand out of habit. I set my bowl down and looked straight at Daniel, my voice low and slow, as if I were trying to recall something from far away. "I just found some old documents," I said. "The savings account your mother and I opened together years ago. There were a few withdrawals. I don't remember signing for them." I didn't look at Melissa. I only looked at my son. Daniel looked up immediately. "Which ones, Dad?" I shrugged lightly, as if it wasn't a big deal. "It was a long time ago, a few years back. Maybe I just forgot." Melissa stopped talking on the phone for a brief moment. Just a moment, but I heard it. She turned toward us and smiled. "Dad forgets money stuff all the time," she said. "Older people are like that." The words came too quickly, too smoothly, as if they had already been rehearsed. Daniel didn't say anything then, but I saw his gaze linger, stay on his wife's face longer than usual. Not suspicion, not yet, just a new kind of attention, like when someone first notices a strange sound in a familiar room. From that day on, Daniel began to observe. He didn't ask me more questions. He didn't confront Melissa, but he started noticing details he had previously ignored. The way Melissa answered questions too quickly, the way she changed the subject whenever Daniel mentioned paperwork, the way she always said, "I'll take care of it," but never showed Daniel exactly what she had taken care of. I saw it in quieter dinners, in Daniel coming home earlier than usual, in the way he stood in the hallway listening instead of going straight into the room. Melissa began to lose patience. Her voice was no longer as sweet as before. Her sentences grew sharper, shorter. She started complaining about Daniel to her mother, loud enough for Daniel to hear, but indirect enough to deny. "I can't explain every single dollar all the time," she said one night. "If you don't trust me, then fine." Daniel didn't argue, but I saw his hand clench. The contradictions in Melissa's words started to surface when Daniel asked a very simple question. "The joint account under Mom and Dad's names," Daniel said. "You said you never touched it, right?" "Of course not," Melissa replied immediately. "I just help manage it." "Then why does the statement show a signature that looks like yours?" Daniel asked, his voice still calm. Melissa froze, not for long, but long enough for me to notice. "It must have been a bank mistake," she said. "You know how those things are." This time Daniel didn't nod. I wasn't there when Daniel discovered the affair. I only learned about it later when he told me, his voice tired and hollow. But I could imagine exactly how that moment unfolded. A message arriving at the wrong time, a call cut off halfway through, a lie told too quickly. Although Daniel was kind, but he wasn't stupid. He had just trusted for too long. Along with that, Daniel uncovered financial transactions Melissa had dismissed as family matters. Money transferred without clear reasons. A secondary account under someone else's name. Things Daniel had never bothered to check because he believed his wife had nothing to hide. Once trust cracks, everything behind it becomes suspect. Daniel began losing sleep. I knew because I heard him walking through the house at midnight. I heard chairs shift softly. I heard sighs being held back. Guilt came to him quietly. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize right away. He simply avoided my eyes for a few days as if he didn't know what face to show me. Until one night, he knocked on my door. Not a soft knock, not hesitant. A firm knock as if he had been standing there for a long time. "Dad, are you still awake?" I opened the door. Daniel stood in the hallway, eyes red, shirt wrinkled. He looked more like a boy than a married man. We sat down. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words, but heavy enough to change the air in the room. "I didn't stand by you," he continued. "I left you. Alone." I didn't blame him. I had never prepared a speech for my son for this moment. I simply placed my hand on the table so he could see it wasn't shaking. "I don't need you to choose sides," I said. "I just need you to see the truth." Daniel lowered his head. I didn't see it. We talked for a long time that night. No raised voices, no accusations, just 2 men, one old, one young, talking for the first time without anyone standing between them. Daniel told me what he had seen, what he had ignored, the ways he had convinced himself everything was fine because facing the truth hurt too much. I didn't speak badly about Melissa. I didn't need to. The truth spoke for itself. When Daniel stood to leave, it was nearly morning. Before he walked out, he turned back and looked at me. "Dad," he said, "I won't let this continue." I nodded. This time it was a real nod. Family, the concept Melissa had used to bind everyone, was no longer entirely in her hands. Daniel had begun to see, and once someone sees, they can never go back to closing their eyes the way they did before. The family meeting was proposed by Melissa on a Saturday afternoon, very much in her style. Not with tension, not with confrontation, but with a softness so convincing that, without clarity, one might mistake it for goodwill. "I think it's time for the family to sit down and talk things through," Melissa said as she set the coffee tray on the table. "The atmosphere in the house lately hasn't been great. I don't want anyone to misunderstand each other." She said that, but her eyes didn't meet mine. They flicked quickly toward Daniel, as if checking where he now stood in the power order she was used to. Daniel stayed silent. But I knew this silence was different from before. I nodded. I didn't object. I didn't refuse. I even took the seat at the center of the dining table, the place Evelyn had occupied for more than 35 years whenever family matters were discussed. Melissa's parents sat across from me. Her mother pressed her lips together, one hand resting on her stiff handbag, as if it held something more important than the words about to be spoken. Her father crossed his arms, leaning back, wearing the look of someone accustomed to making decisions for others. The opening tone was polite. Melissa spoke first, in a gentle voice that had clearly been practiced. "Dad Ray," she said, "I know you've lived here a long time. This house holds so many memories for you. But the reality is, you're not young anymore." She spoke slowly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. "We're just worried about you," she continued. "Living alone, dealing with paperwork, complicated things. If something happens, it can be very hard to manage." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish, just as Thomas had advised. Melissa signaled to her mother. The woman immediately opened her bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers, placing them on the dining table, right on the wooden surface Evelyn used to wipe down every morning. "These are just some procedures for peace of mind," she said, her tone like she was explaining something to a child. "Nothing serious." I looked at the stack. I didn't touch it. Melissa slid the papers toward me, gently but firmly. "It's just a power of attorney," she said, "so Daniel and I can help handle financial matters if you're tired, and medical care documents in case you're not able to decide for yourself. Oh, and this one too." She flipped a few pages. "Transfer of home management rights. Just management, not selling. Everything is still yours." The way she emphasized certain words was very deliberate. I picked up the papers. I read, very slowly, very carefully. I let them see me reading without rushing. I saw Daniel tense. I saw his hand tighten on his thigh. But he didn't speak. He was waiting for me. When I set the papers down, Melissa smiled, the smile of someone who believed everything had reached its final stage. "Just sign, Dad," she said. "Let things be simple. You don't really want to keep going back and forth to banks, courts, and complicated places anymore." I looked up at her. "No," I said, "just one word, not loud, not harsh, but enough to make the room sink." Melissa froze. Her parents glanced at each other. Her mother frowned. "What did you say?" Melissa asked, still trying to keep her composure. "I said no," I repeated. "I'm not signing." A silence stretched out. I could clearly hear the wall clock ticking behind me. "Dad Ray," Melissa said, her tone beginning to shift. "Do you understand that you're making things difficult for everyone?" "No," I replied. "I'm just keeping my rights." She let out a soft laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're saying that because you don't fully understand the consequences," she said. "If you don't sign, things will become more complicated." "How complicated?" I asked. The question was like a light tap on an already cracked wall. Melissa breathed more heavily. Her voice sharpened. "You're older," she said. "The law has ways to protect people who no longer have the capacity to decide for themselves." Daniel turned to look at his wife. His expression darkened. "Melissa," he said, "what are you saying?" But she didn't stop. "I'm telling the truth," she replied. "If necessary, the court can intervene. Doctors can evaluate. If Dad Ray doesn't cooperate, we won't have any other choice." Her mother nodded in agreement. "We've done this before," she said, her voice low but clear. "There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just procedure." I straightened my back. I let them see that I heard every word. "You mean a nursing home?" I asked, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Melissa looked directly at me. "If necessary." She said it the same way one might talk about turning a living room into a bedroom. "You'll be taken care of better," she continued. "And the house, that should be handled by someone who's capable of managing it." Daniel shot up from his chair. "Stop it," he said, his voice shaking but not weak. "You've gone too far." Melissa turned to her husband. "You don't understand. I'm doing this for you." I watched the scene, and my heart didn't hurt the way I had once imagined it would. Maybe because I had prepared for this moment for far too long. I stood up slowly. I didn't pick up the papers. I didn't push them away. I simply let them lie there, as evidence against themselves. "I'm not signing," I said again, "and I won't sign no matter what threats you make." Melissa laughed louder this time, no more hiding it. "You think you have a choice?" she said. "You think you're still in control of this?" I looked straight into her eyes. "Yes," I said. "I still am." She froze, very briefly, but enough. The meeting collapsed under its own weight. Melissa's parents gathered the papers without another word. Daniel stood there, unsure of whom to follow. As for me, when I turned and walked back toward my room, my hand was in my jacket pocket. The phone was recording. Every word, every sentence, not a single one missing. When I closed my bedroom door, I leaned my back against the old wooden door and closed my eyes for a second. I knew. I was very close now. Close enough to feel the loss of control in Melissa's eyes, the thing she had tried so hard to hide all this time. The final piece had come to me on its own. The gathering took place that evening, exactly the way Melissa liked it. Not too crowded, not too loud, just enough people to project an image of a stable family to the neighbors and a few social acquaintances. She called it a casual get-together, but I understood the real purpose clearly. After the failed family meeting, Melissa needed to prove she was still in control. And the fastest way to do that was to put on another performance, for outside eyes. I didn't refuse the invitation. I showed up on time, wearing the old gray jacket Evelyn once said suited me best. I moved a little more slowly than usual, deliberately letting my fatigue show. I let the light reveal the wrinkles around my eyes. I let everyone see an aging man struggling to keep his balance in his own home. Melissa watched me from the moment I entered the living room. She stood near the drinks table, holding a glass of red wine, her social smile already in place. Every time someone came over to greet me, she followed with her eyes, measuring my influence on each person. The wine kept flowing. Melissa's glass was never empty for long. I didn't need to check the time to know when the moment would come. The more people like her drink, the less patient they become with their disguises. Soft music played in the background, laughter and conversation intertwined. I sat in the chair near the window, pretending to listen to an unimportant story from the neighbor across the street. I knew Melissa was approaching. I felt it before I heard her footsteps. "Dad Ray," she said, her voice drawn out, tinged with alcohol. "Can you come over here with me for a minute?" I looked up slowly. "Is something wrong?" "It's just a private conversation," she replied, her smile tilting slightly off-center. I stood up, no hesitation, no resistance. I let her lead me to the corner of the kitchen, where the light was dimmer, where the music was muted by walls, where words could slip out without too much control. Melissa set her glass down on the counter, turned her back for a moment as if to steady herself, then faced me again. This time, her eyes no longer pretended to be gentle. They were sharp, cold, and filled with restrained irritation. "You embarrassed me today," she said, her voice low but clear. "Do you know that?" I lowered my head slightly. "I'm sorry if I put you in an awkward position." That answer was like pouring fuel on a fire. "Don't pretend," she snapped. "You think you've won, don't you?" I looked up at her, widening my eyes slightly as if trying to understand something too complicated. "I don't understand what you mean," I said. You're just an old man living off the past," Melissa cut in. "And you're in everyone else's way." She stepped closer. The distance between us shrank. I could clearly smell the alcohol on her breath, mixed with her familiar perfume. "Listen carefully," she said, her words now dropping without being chosen carefully. "You're going to sign those papers, sooner or later." I swallowed, making sure my throat moved noticeably. "And if I don't?" I asked, letting my voice tremble at the right moment. "If you don't," she continued, "we'll do it another way." "What? What do you mean?" I asked. Melissa laughed. Not a social laugh, but the laugh of someone tired of being patient. "You really think you're still capable of making all your own decisions?" she said. "All it takes is a few medical evaluations, a few signatures in the right places, and it's taken care of." I took half a step back, bracing my hand on the counter. I let my shoulders shake slightly. What are you talking about?" I asked. "About you no longer being allowed to decide for yourself," she said flatly. "They call it loss of capacity. It happens to older people all the time. Nothing unusual." She tilted her head, lowering her voice even further, almost to a whisper. "After that," she said, "this house will be sold. You'll be moved somewhere more suitable, somewhere quiet, out of the way." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of fear, but to keep my expression from betraying me. I don't want to go to a nursing home," I said, my voice breaking. Melissa shrugged. "That won't be your choice." The words fell between us, heavy and bare. No disguise left, no family veneer, just power and an open threat. I opened my eyes and looked at her. I let tears well just enough to make my eyes glisten but not spill over. "If I sign, then what?" I asked softly. Melissa studied me like a hunter watching exhausted prey. "If you sign," she said, "everything stays smooth. You can stay here for a while, at least until the house is sold." I nodded very slowly. I need time." "You don't have much time," she replied immediately. "But fine, I'll give you a few days." She reached out and placed her hand lightly on my arm. The touch wasn't comforting. It felt like a territorial mark. "Don't disappoint me again," she said. "I don't want to make things worse." I nodded again. "I understand." Melissa picked up her wine glass and turned back toward the living room, where laughter continued as if nothing had happened. She slipped back into her perfect role within seconds, as though our conversation had never existed. I stayed in the kitchen corner for a moment longer. My hand remained in my jacket pocket. The phone was there, warm from recording every word, every sentence, every pause. Nothing was missing. When I returned to the living room, Daniel looked at me. His eyes scanned my face, then flicked to Melissa. I gave a slight shake of my head, just barely. He understood. The gathering ended later than expected. I went to my room first. When the door closed behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed, took out the phone, and opened the recording. I didn't need to listen to it all. I only needed to confirm that everything was there. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The game was over. Not with noise, not with anger, but with the very words of the person who believed I was no longer capable of protecting myself. Evelyn had been right, and I, finally, had all the pieces. Oh, that morning came very slowly. I woke before full daylight, not because I hadn't slept, but because my body had grown used to never fully resting. Pale light filtered through the window, casting soft gray shapes across the floor, making the small back room feel more like temporary lodging than a part of the house I once called home. I didn't rush out of bed. I sat there for a few minutes, listening. Footsteps in the hallway, the refrigerator opening, quiet voices, Melissa and her mother. Everything continued as usual, as if the party the night before had been nothing more than a scratch on the surface of a much larger plan. They didn't know that while they slept, another gear had begun to turn. My phone vibrated lightly. Not a ringtone, just a signal arranged in advance. I picked it up without looking at the number. "We've filed," Thomas's voice came through, low and steady. "The emergency protective order has been approved. The judge signed it at 6:40 a.m. I closed my eyes, not out of relief, but because one phase had truly ended. "The police will arrive within the hour," Thomas continued. "Go about your routine. Don't notify anyone. Don't argue." "I understand," I said. When I hung up, the house was still calm, a false calm, like the surface of a lake before the wind rises. I got dressed slowly, as I did every day. I made coffee, pouring it into Evelyn's old mug. I sat at the dining table, opened the newspaper, and didn't read a single word. I just waited. The doorbell rang at 8:12 a.m. This time, it wasn't the familiar rhythm of a neighbor. It was firm, intentional, like a period placed exactly where it belonged. Melissa stood up first. She glanced at me, her eyes flicking over me out of habit. She probably thought it was a delivery or someone coming because of the party the night before. I didn't stop her. I didn't stand up. When Melissa opened the door, I heard a man's voice, clear, neutral. "Police, we need to speak with Mr. Raymond Cole." The house froze. Melissa spun around to look at me, her eyes wide, not yet understanding what was happening. "I'm here," I said, setting the newspaper down and standing up. Two officers stepped inside. They didn't look at Melissa first. They looked at me. One was middle-aged, the other younger. Their expressions held no judgment, just duty. "Mr. Cole," the older officer said, "we're here to serve an emergency protective order issued by the court." He handed over a set of documents sealed in a plastic sleeve. I didn't need to touch them to know what they were. Melissa stammered. Wait, what is this? This is a misunderstanding. This is our house. No, I said calmly. This is my house. The atmosphere in the living room shifted instantly. Melissa's parents came out of the kitchen, faces confused. Her mother began speaking rapidly, her voice rising. Her father started talking about rights, about family. The officer raised his hand, signaling for silence. This order requires the individual's name to vacate the residence immediately, he said. That includes Ms. Melissa Cole and her relatives. Melissa let out a dry laugh. That's impossible. We live here. We take care of him. The officer turned to me. Would you like to add anything, Mr. Cole? I looked at Melissa. For the first time in a long while, I didn't need to maintain my role. I want to be alone in my own home, I said, and I don't feel safe with them here. The sentence, simple and precise, carried more weight than any accusation. Melissa screamed, not from pain, but because power was slipping from her grasp. Daniel? She turned to her husband. Say something! Daniel stood at the end of the hallway, as if he had expected this moment. He looked at me, then at his wife. This time, there was no hesitation. I'm standing with my father, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. And I don't trust you anymore. That sentence struck Melissa harder than any legal document ever could. She turned back to look at me, her eyes burning with anger before shifting into panic. What did you do? She shouted. Did you set us up? I didn't answer. The police instructed them to gather their essential personal belongings. No arguing, no delays. Melissa's parents began packing in silence, their faces drained of color. The suitcases that had once been set down on my floor with confidence were now being dragged away in chaos. Melissa tried to say something else, but no one was listening anymore. When the door closed behind them, the sound was soft. Not a dramatic slam, just the ordinary sound of a door shutting. But to me, it was the sound of a house being returned. Daniel stayed behind. He didn't follow his wife outside. He turned to me, his eyes red, but he wasn't crying. Dad, he said, can I stay? I nodded. You're my son. You don't have to ask. We stood there for a while without speaking. The house suddenly felt bigger, emptier. No more unfamiliar footsteps. No more voices cutting in. I walked slowly around the living room. I looked at the table, the chair, the places that had been taken over. There was no sense of victory, no triumph, just a strange emptiness, like leaving a battle and not knowing whether you're supposed to feel happy or sad. Daniel helped me straighten a few things that had been disturbed. He didn't ask much. He just did it, as a quiet form of atonement. By noon, the house was completely still. I sat down in my old armchair and looked out the window. Sunlight fell across the front lawn, where just the night before there had been forced laughter. My phone vibrated again. Thomas. The order has been enforced, he said. But Ray, I need to remind you of one thing. I know, I replied. This isn't over. Thomas paused for a moment. That's right. The real legal battle is only beginning. They'll counterattack. They'll sue. They'll say you were manipulated, deceived. I looked around the house, the walls, the memories, the new empty spaces. I'm ready, I said. When I hung up, I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like an old man who had just reclaimed the right to stand on his own in his own life. And sometimes, that is more than enough. The trial took place on a cloudy morning, the kind of heavy gray clouds that make the light in a courtroom feel colder than usual. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I didn't want to walk in already being carried along by the current. I wanted to sit down, breathe, and look straight at the place where everything was about to be laid out. No whispers, no hidden corners of kitchens or hallways. Melissa filed a counterclaim exactly as Thomas had predicted. She accused me of being manipulated, deceived, no longer capable of making my own decisions. The filing was written in a very familiar language, cold, proper, and carefully framed to turn everything into an unfortunate family misunderstanding. In it, I wasn't the victim, but a difficult old man, provoked by outsiders, harming his own family. I read the filing once, then folded it up. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shocked. It was simply the final confirmation that this path had no more turns. In the courtroom, Melissa sat across from me. She was neatly dressed, her hair tied back, her makeup light but precise. If you only glanced at her, you'd never imagine she was the same person who had whispered threats in the corner of my kitchen, alcohol on her breath, her voice cold as steel. Daniel sat several rows away from her, not beside her, not meeting her eyes. That distance said more than any testimony. When the hearing began, I listened. I listened to the accusations read out in the lawyer's even voice. I listened as they tried to paint a picture of an aging father who was paranoid, easily influenced, in need of protection. I didn't react. I had learned to let the truth speak for itself. Thomas stood when it was our turn. He didn't raise his voice. He wasn't dramatic. He began with the smallest things, things that, taken alone, might not look like crimes. The text messages, the emails, the repeated comments about age, about safety, about how older people shouldn't make decisions on their own. Then came the financial evidence, bank statements, signatures that didn't match, transfers with no reasonable explanation. Secondary accounts opened without my knowledge. With each layer of evidence presented, the room grew quieter. Melissa began to lose her composure. I could see it in the way her hands clenched, in the slight bounce of her foot under the table, in the way her eyes kept darting toward her lawyer. Then came the part I knew would change everything. Thomas called a witness. Margaret Hale walked into the courtroom with slow but steady steps. She wasn't dressed elaborately, just a simple coat, her gray hair neatly arranged. But as she stood there, speaking about Evelyn, about the notes, about years of quiet observation, I could feel the air in the room shift. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply told her story. She spoke about a woman who had seen the danger long before it arrived. She spoke about very specific instructions. Write down dates, times, exact words, no speculation. She spoke about Evelyn's greatest fear, not losing property, but that I would lose the right to choose for myself. When Margaret mentioned the old phone, the recordings, Melissa's head snapped up. Then the recording was played. The voice echoed clearly through the courtroom, impossible to deny. Just a few medical evaluations. After that, the house will be sold. He won't be allowed to decide for himself anymore. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't a lawyer's voice. It was Melissa's, unmasked, undisguised. Moses, she lowered her head. For the first time, I saw her shoulders truly collapse. Melissa's attorney tried to argue, talked about context, about emotional moments, but those words sounded weak in a room already filled with truth. The ruling came after a deliberation that felt shorter than I had expected. The court dismissed all of Melissa's counterclaims. It upheld the protective order. It confirmed coercion, psychological abuse, and intent to seize assets. The file was also referred to investigators for additional financial violations. Melissa lost access to me, lost access to my assets, and in the eyes of those who had once called her daughter-in-law, I saw something else. She had lost her credibility, her standing, everything that had once allowed her to control others. Daniel filed for divorce that same week. He didn't say much to me about the decision. He said only one thing: I can't keep living in a lie. I didn't hug him. I didn't console him. I just placed my hand on his shoulder for a long moment, long enough for him to know I was there. When it was over, when the courtroom slowly emptied, I stayed seated for a few more minutes. I looked at the chair where Melissa had been sitting. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel victorious. I felt closure, like closing an old door that had been creaking for far too long. Not because you hate the door, but because you can't keep living with the noise. I stepped outside. The sky was still cloudy, but it no longer felt heavy. My life didn't become lighter after that trial, but it became clearer. And at this age, sometimes clarity is the most precious thing of all. After the trial, I didn't go straight home. I walked for a long time without a specific destination, just to let my mind slow down. The city was as noisy as ever. Cars moving, people rushing, everyone caught up in their own concerns. No one knew that, for me, a chapter had just closed. There were no fireworks, no applause, just the very real silence of a man who had finally stood upright in his own life. That evening, when I returned to the old house, I opened the drawer Evelyn had told me to open, only when there was no way back. This time I wasn't looking for legal documents. I was looking for what remained. A letter. A thin envelope. The paper slightly yellowed. Evelyn's handwriting was the same as ever, neat, unadorned, but firm. I sat down, turned on the desk lamp, and read each line as if I were hearing her voice again in the quiet room. Evelyn wrote that she didn't want me to live the rest of my life in fear or resentment. She knew I would be hurt by facing the truth about our son, about our daughter-in-law, about people we once called family. But she believed I was clear-minded enough not to turn that pain into a prison. The house is just wood, stone, and memories, she wrote. Don't let it hold you if it keeps you from breathing. I folded the letter very slowly. It wasn't a farewell. It was a reminder. A few months later, I decided to sell the old house. That decision didn't come from impulse. I spent a long time in each room, touching every wall, every door frame. I remembered mornings when Evelyn opened the windows to let the sunlight in. I remembered family dinners filled with genuine laughter, but I also knew that if I stayed, I would keep living alongside the shadow of a battle that had already passed. I sold the house to a young couple. They looked at it with excitement, the way I once had 35 years earlier. When I signed the papers, I didn't feel loss. I felt a circle closing. I moved to a smaller, quieter town near the coast. The new house isn't big, but it's bright, airy, and every morning I can make coffee and hear the distant sound of waves. No one here knows who I am or what I went through. Here, I'm not the father who was sued, not the old man with family trouble. I'm just Raymond, an older man living slowly. Daniel visited me one windy afternoon. He drove for hours just to sit with me on the porch. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. Some things had already been said fully in silence. He apologized again, not with pleading words, but with real change. He started his life over, learning the difference between love and control, learning not to trade truth for surface peace. We healed not through promises, but through time. That evening, after Daniel left, I sat alone and reread Evelyn's letter. I finally understood that what she wanted for me wasn't victory, and it wasn't revenge. She wanted me to live with dignity, with clarity, and with the right to choose for myself. And here, I want to pause for a moment to say something to you, the one listening to my story. The story in this video is a fictional story inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, created to offer moral value, life lessons, and emotional resonance for viewers. It does not encourage imitating any actions shown, does not incite harm, and does not target any individual or organization. I believe the most important thing this story leaves behind isn't the tension or conflict, but very real values. The right of older adults to protect themselves, the importance of boundaries within families, awareness of emotional and financial abuse, and the understanding that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is a strategy to preserve safety and dignity. If you or someone you love is in a similar situation, please don't endure it alone. Talk to someone you trust. Document what's happening clearly. Seek legal advice or community support when needed. Asking for help does not make you weaker. It helps you stand more firmly. And before this story ends, I want to share a few honest words from my heart. If you're still watching, I want to ask, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever witnessed or experienced situations that forced you to stay silent to protect yourself? If you'd like, leave a comment. Not to argue, but to share. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next stories. Your presence, even in silence, is a form of companionship I deeply value. Thank you for staying, for listening to an older man tell the story of learning how to stand upright in his own life. At this age, I don't wish for much more than peace. And if my story can give you a little clarity, a little courage, or simply the feeling of being understood, then that is more than enough.